Okay, so just a brief introduction. We're very happy and pleased that we can start our research seminar all over again with a new season, a spring semester for ALEF, which is a research group based in Romania and Cluj-Napoca and Bucharest mostly. We are interested in various topics in analytic philosophy and logic, and our main event is this research seminar that you're taking part into, which is which takes place every other week. This is, as I've said, the start of a new semester, and we have just finished up our program, which we are going to probably to publicize it in a few days. But our first seminar, as you see, starts. Our first seminar is with Ragnar van der Merwe from the University of Johannesburg. We are very happy to have him here. He has also taken part in other initiatives of members of our group or our group in other conferences that we have organized. Yes, there is a question here. So we are going to share the program as soon as it's done completely. At this point, we just have the speakers. We don't have all the info, all the dates, but we're going to share it in a few days. Okay. So coming back to Ragnar, we're very happy and pleased to have him here. He's going to hold a talk titled "Why Did the Philosopher Cross the Road on Successful Actions in Complex Systems?" As I said, he comes from the University of Johannesburg, and we're very happy to have him here. So I will open. I'll give the floor to Ragnar. As a rule of thumb, talks are around 1 hour, but they may also take a bit less, and then we'll have the Q&A, which is virtually another hour, but it can also take a little less time. So everybody here is very welcome. Yeah, I think I've lost my video. Yeah. Okay, so everybody here is very welcome to join in the Q&A. Thank you, Ragnar, for coming to our seminar. And as I've said, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about some of the work I've been doing. As you can see, we're talking about complex systems and specifically action in complex systems. The outline of the talk, I'm just going to briefly start by defining complexity and some other key terms. I'll then introduce two approaches that one finds in the literature about action and complexity, an analytic or reductionist approach and a post-structural or postmodern approach. And then I'm going to propose a third way, given problems with the other two. And this is an everyday or commonsensical approach, a sort of a pragmatist approach that draws from Gerd Gigerenser's notion of heuristics and a more recently developed modification of his view called embodied rationality. So what is complexity? Just a few quotes to sort of, it's a technical subject, but just for our purposes, we can just get a basic idea. So according to Arthur, common to all studies on complexity are systems with multiple elements adapting or reacting to the pattern these elements create. According to Celliers, a complex system is a system that is comprised of a large number of entities that display a high level of nonlinear interactivity. Most of us have a pretty good idea, an intuitive idea of what a complex system is or what complexity is, and that'll do for today. However, most complexity research focuses on actions on complex systems, that is interventions in or the management of complex systems. So in business studies, there's a lot of talk about managing complex systems like a business, an organization, or how do we manage or control a pandemic, another type of complex system. But what's been underexplored is the topic of actions in complex systems. So not when we're trying to control or manage a complex system, but when we are actually as agents navigating within complex systems. That has been much less discussed. In my research, I've identified two approaches to this question of acting in complex systems. There's the dominant analytic approach, and then an underappreciated and under-discussed post-structural approach. So this is sort of the classic kind of analytic continental divide in philosophy, that the two different approaches, the sort of analytic, logical, rational approach, and the post-structural approach, which is more existential, continental, postmodern, that sort of thing. So Paul Selliers has a quote from him, who's sort of one of the pioneers of the post-structural approach. He says, on the one hand, there is the belief that the world can be made rationally transparent, that with enough hard work, knowledge about the world can be made objective. That's the analytic approach. Thinkers like Descartes and Habermas are often framed as being responsible for this kind of attitude. It goes under numerous names, including positivism, modernism, objectivism, rationalism, and epistemological fundamentalism. On the other hand, there is the belief that knowledge is only possible from a personal or cultural specific perspective, and that it can therefore never be objective or universal. This position is ascribed, correctly or not, to numerous thinkers in the more recent past, like Kuhn, Rorty, and Derrida. And its many names include relativism, idealism, postmodernism, perspectivism, and flapdoodle. So he's kind of taking a bit of a dig at himself there. Sorry. So just some examples of the analytic approach. On the one hand, one might try to develop a physical conception of complexity. So David Christian, with his big history theory, has complexity as a kind of result of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. The creation of complexity is driven by free energy that decreases with increasing entropy. So all complex systems are reduced to this process, this thermodynamic process. So it's kind of a reductionist approach. There's also a computational conception. So one could try, like Seth Lloyd, try to say that all complexity is reduced of quantum computation. Complexity results from quantum computation across quantum multiverses. How about that? Stuart Kaufman has talked about complexity in terms of autocatalytic sets, so they can be reduced to that. Stephen Wolfram has talked about cellular automata as being the foundational unit that complex systems can be reduced to. So those are just some of the analytic approaches out there. There are some problems with this approach. The analytic approach attempts to reduce complex systems to perfectly predictable, simple systems obeying deterministic laws. This is kind of this is going on in the AI debate now, right? Can AI or AGI deal with complexity? And there's arguments that it in principle cannot, because complex systems are by their nature unpredictable. So ChatGPT can never master the world's complexity. It always has to simplify the system and deal with a sort of a simplified and neater version of what the real world is actually like. And that will always lead to errors. And that means that AGI is impossible, or so the argument goes. But so the problem is the analytic approach aims to reduce complex systems to perfectly predictable, simple systems obeying deterministic laws, but complex systems are notoriously recalcitrant to accurate modeling and prediction. For example, economic recession, societal revolutions, and pandemics. Okay, so I mean, no economic model could have predicted COVID-19 or what Nassim Taleb calls black swan events. Always will interfere with your attempts to model complex systems, at least accurately, and as time goes on, it becomes less and less accurate, more and more difficult. Another problem is that the analytic approach separates the subject from the object. The subject, me, and the object, the world, stand in a correspondence relationship. But we cannot stand outside of complexity. This is one of the points that the postmodernists make, is that we are complex systems, immersed in complex systems. We're always sort of situated in the world. We are not separate. We cannot take a God's eye view where we stand apart from complexity. We are always part of what we're studying. So this is kind of the issue in the philosophy of experiment in science. What role does the experimenter play in the experiment, especially in the social sciences? This becomes a major issue where the experimenter or the investigator interferes with the subject matter, with the data, by being part of the system, complex system. And the analytic approach seeks to reduce, control, and manipulate complex systems. So this is just sort of an ethical issue. It's not that important, but it's important for the post-structuralists that this kind of attempt to control complexity or manipulate it or manage it has a sort of an authoritarian or kind of a hierarchical, oppressive aspect to it. And so existentialists and postmodernists are very keen on freedom and escaping from authoritarianism. So that can, for some people, be a problem. And so the sort of the great grandfather of post-structuralism, Jacques Derrida, has this to say about decision making and action, as I introduced the post-structuralist approach. He says, irrespective of what you know, you make a leap into the decision. This leap into the responsibility is an infinite one, and you take a decision only in a situation when there is something undecidable, when you don't know what to do. You have to go through an ordeal of undecidability in order to decide. So to that extent, the result by definition is unpredictable, unknown. That is why it is an intervention which has, because it is not linked essentially to knowledge, something obscure, something even mystical. The threat of the leap I mentioned not only threatens a break with science in the strict sense, but with philosophy as ontology, as knowledge. So he has this sort of radical kind of talk that Derrida is known for. Sort of, whenever we make a decision, it's radically unpredictable. We have to sort of leap. Existentialists have a similar sort of idea. We're thrown into the world. Nothing's predictable. The world is chaotic. And therefore, we are sort of compelled, or we just sort of, by a kind of a volition, we act in the world without knowing really what we're doing, which is in stark contrast to the analytic approach, where the idea is that in principle there are laws that we can follow when navigating complexity. So the post-structuralist approach, so I'm going to focus on a group who call their view critical complexity, and they've been, I mean, Derrida didn't talk about complex systems, but this group have taken Derrida's view, particularly semantics, and adapted it to discussions about complex systems and actions in complex systems. And following Derrida, and given the complexity of the world and the play of difference, I won't go into what difference is. I'll assume you have a basic idea. Well, if anyone knows what it is, but it's this kind of disruptive force that in post-structuralism, it kind of disrupts. So anytime you try to capture meaning, or you try to capture truth or reality or knowledge, you try to secure it and say that you know it or understand it, there's this sort of thing called difference, especially in semantic systems, that sort of disrupts things and makes it impossible for you to ever grasp meaning in particular. Our actions are undecidable and ultimately determined by an unbridled ethical leap. So this leap that we make in the face of complexity is inherently ethical. This is another familiar post-structuralist move, where because things are uncertain and always context dependent and so on, we turn to ethics as sort of first philosophy in order to inform what we do. So everything becomes ethical. That's a sort of a famous post-structuralist slogan. It's all ethics, or everything's political is a similar sort of slogan. According to Wurman, who's part of this critical complexity group, She says we undergo a terrible experience of undecidability prior to acting on or intervening in our complex world. So there's this kind of existential angst that we have because there's no rules, everything's uncertain, so we just have to leap. And I'll call this radical voluntarism, this view. They don't call it that, as you'd expect. So radical voluntarism, according to Derrida, when engaged in decision-making, we must go through an ordeal of undecidability in order to decide. So to this extent, the result by definition is unpredictable, unknown. This ordeal results from the absence of any determinants for decision-making. For example, norms of rationality. So they reject rationality. Rationality cannot help us. Rationality is associated with sort of patriarchy and Eurocentrism and so on. And so that's no good. Consequently, in order for a decision to be a decision, it has to go through a moment when, irrespective of what you know, you make a leap into the decision. Such leaps, says Derrida, not only threaten a break with science, as I quoted already in a strict sense, but philosophy as an ontology. So this view, it has its appeal in that it's kind of liberating. We're free, free from authoritarian constraints. We're liberated to choose. We are, and that was Sartre's big sort of appeal, was this notion of freedom, and how we can act in the world without constraints or oppressive notions like rationality or rules, etc. We are free to incite transformation. In the face of radical uncertainty, we leap to ethical action. We take a step in the dark as such. Problems with radical voluntarism. So how do we decide to act? So this is the problem. What informs, if we have these ethical volitions, what determines, why do we act one way rather than another? Why do we leap one way rather than another at any given moment? So in the face of overwhelming complexity, why do we behave one way rather than another? If there's no rules, no constraints, it should lead to a crazier, random behavior or cognitive dissonance. We should just act randomly without any kind of purpose or goals. If we take this literally, but this is not what we witness day to day. We seem to make decisions daily without anything outwardly resembling Derrida's ordeal of undecidability or Wurman's terrible experience of undecidability. So agents go around all day, every day. We navigate complex systems like the economic system, the traffic system, quite easily without even thinking about it while we're on the phone, maybe. We don't seem to go, at least there's no obvious evidence of this kind of existential angst that we're supposed to experience. So my alternative is we look at rules of thumb, or what Gerd Gigerenzer calls heuristics. And the idea here is that we can ground successful decision-making in the sensory motor capabilities we employ during goal attainment, where grounding is cashed out in suitably weak, instrumental, and naturalized terms rather than in metaphysically constitutive terms. So we're goal-seeking agents, and we make decisions according to our goals, and this helps us. I'll get into more detail now how this relates to complexity. According to Giorgio and colleagues, embodied rationality, which is an important notion here. So embodied rationality is not kind of this Cartesian rationality that the post-structuralists worry about. When they talk about rationality, they talk about Descartes and this kind of rationality which sort of descends on us from on high as this kind of otherworldly force that is sort of oppressive and constricts our freedom. And this is not that kind of rationality. This is a sort of almost like a Darwinian rationality that emerges bottom up and comes as part of our evolutionary endowment. And as goal-seeking agents, we navigate the world using this kind of naturalized or Darwinian, or what they call embodied rationality, which invites us to abandon a third-person rationality, that's the Cartesian one, where cognitive processes can be expressed as objectified algorithmic rules for information processing, and calls into account the biological realm. Embodied rationality emphasizes the constitutive dependence of heuristics on the human body, and in particular on the sensory motor system. Cognitive processes can be understood precisely as they are grounded on the motor sensory system and not prescinding from it. So Gigerenzer originally developed ecological rationality, which Mastrogiorgio and Petrarca have transformed or modified into embodied rationality. And Gigerenzer has recently sort of embraced this new version of his original view, as far as I can tell. In this 2021 paper, he says ecological rationality is a study of how humans and other animals rely on heuristics to achieve their goals in situations of uncertainty. It differs from axiomatic rationality, which asks whether humans conform to logical principles. So this is a naturalized Darwinian notion of rationality about how we navigate complexity or uncertainty. And it's not the kind of rationality that the post-structurists are worried about, which is about whether we are kind of like robotic automata conforming and following these sort of Cartesian strict rules. Heuristics, says Gigerenzer, are fast and frugal rules of thumb that work in real-world environments of natural complexity, where the optimal strategy is often unknown and computationally intractable. Like other animals, we follow intuitive cognitive strategies of the sort that proved useful to our ancestors and that can be successfully applied to much of our modern environment. Gigerenzer uses the example of playing chess. We play chess by employing a kind of intuitive reasoning, and sometimes play it very well, without having to either calculate all possible outcomes of every move and without being overwhelmed by the complexity inherent in the game. So we don't need to know, like a chess computer does, we don't need to know every single possible move that could be made. And we also don't become completely overwhelmed by the complexity and just have to make random decisions as the postmodern approach might suggest. Instead, we have this ability to navigate complexity in a kind of a natural Darwinian fashion. The same, there's another example of a chef. So a chef doesn't need to know all the rules of chemistry underlying what she's doing, what she's cooking. She has a kind of an intuitive sense of this much salt, this much butter, let it cook for so long. She doesn't have to sort of study the physics and chemistry underlying it in order to form a perfect souffle or whatever it might be. But she's also not completely confused given the complexity of the situation and just sort of throws the ingredients together randomly. Another example that Gigerenzer uses is what he calls the gaze heuristic. Here there's the example of a baseball outfielder catching a fly ball. Baseball outfielders do not perform anything like a mathematical calculation related to measurements of height, distance, mass, acceleration, and the like. Instead, they simply follow what Gigerenzer calls the gaze heuristic. Fixate your eyes on the ball, run, and adjust your speed so that the angle of gaze remains constant. They're not necessarily processing those exact terms. It's almost instinctive. There's a kind of a cognitive process running without having to calculate the trajectory of every single ball, which is what an AI would have to do. And that's why AI struggles so much with simple things like catching balls or running, things that we do so easily. We obviously did not evolve to catch fly balls, but the ability to do so is an exaptation from capabilities our ancestors employed during activities like hunting for food. So this ability to navigate complexity is part of our evolutionary endowment rather than something we necessarily learn in a textbook, although you can obviously improve with practice. So returning to embodied rationality, which, as I said, is an extension of ecological rationality, proponents seek to ground rationality in our sensory motor capability. So as the term embodied suggests, this is kind of rationality doesn't come from on high. It's part of who we are as biological Darwinian creatures, and it's sort of emerges out of that process. Similar to how some pragmatists ground decision-making and choice and rationality in experience. So there's this kind of the locus or the interface where we interact with the world becomes the source of decision-making, rationality, and so on. It's not an internal thing or an external thing. It kind of resides. So it's grounded at the interface of self, agent, and world, or inner and outer. The sensory motor capabilities of those biological bodily skills employed in receiving sensory information from the world and then generating an appropriate motor response. They serve at the interface between cognition and environment and play a crucial role in goal attainment. Rationality, as the utilization of reasoning heuristics, is grounded specifically in those motor sensory capabilities we employ during goal attainment. I'll talk about the goal of crossing the road just now. We will see how this plays out in just an everyday scenario. So Gigerentis says embodied heuristics are rules of thumb that exploit specific sensory and motor capabilities in order to facilitate high-quality decisions in an uncertain world. So when crossing the road in a complex traffic system, for example, agents supply a heuristic that goes something like this. So it could be something else. This is just an intuitive case of something like the gaze heuristic that we were talking about earlier. Something like this process is going on inside the mind, but it could be it could vary according to context. But it's something like, if you want to get safely to the other side, survey your environment, recall similar experiences from the past, from memory, predict the behavior of relevant moving parts, various cars, other pedestrians, etc. Then you make a decision based on the steps preceding it, and then act. Then there's a movement forwards and we act. So this fairly simple process is kind of, or, you know, as a mother would say to her child, look left, look right, look left again, and then cross. Something like that, very simple process, or heuristic that we use when navigating complexity. At least the kind of complex systems that we encounter day to day. So I'm not talking about radically complex systems like, you know, things you find in mathematics or, you know, I'm not saying that this works for everything. Obviously, it doesn't work for long-term economic forecasting, but I'm talking about the kind of everyday interactions we have, which is most of our interactions with complexity. All day, we're having these kind of simple everyday interactions, navigations within complexity, which are not really discussed in the literature and sort of overlooked. And there's this focus on either on managing and controlling complex systems, as I said, or when scholars talk about acting in complex systems, they tend to talk about drastic cases like pandemics and, you know, divorce or something really dramatic. And so my point here is just that in the vast majority of cases, as we go about our day-to-day world, we're actually dealing with complex systems very easily, and that needs to be recognized as well, and not just these dramatic, the big cases, you know, the economy, the recession, the pandemic, etc. And applying this heuristic is rational if doing so generally leads to success, where success is cashed out in terms of the bodily act involving sensory motor capabilities of attaining one's goal. So you're rational if you attain your goal, rather than if you meet some standard determined a priori. And the goal in this case is getting safely to the other side. In this way, agents perform successful actions in complex systems without calling on deterministic laws, as in the analytic approach, or radical voluntarism, as in the postmodern approach. So I live in South Africa, and we can take this country as an example. So according to the Automobile Association of South Africa is one of the highest national rates of road deaths globally. Approximately 30% of these are pedestrian deaths. 5,339, according to the report. So let's just say 5,000 deaths. I think that was in 2021. 5,000 pedestrian deaths in the year 2021. Although, of course, tragic for those involved, these fatal instances make up a tiny fraction of the overall sample pool. Simplifying grossly, imagine that there's one road crossing per South African per day. So imagine that each South African crosses the road once per day. The total South African population is approximately 60 million, so that would result in 60 million road crossings per day. This amounts to approximately 20 billion road crossings 60 million per day results in 20 billion road crossings each year, out of which 5,300 result in fatalities. So it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the time that we get this wrong, despite not having any clear algorithmic rules to follow when we're crossing the road, and we're also obviously not just throwing ourselves into the road hoping for the best, as the existentialist or the post-structuralist seems to intimate that we are. Now, obviously, not everyone crosses the road. Infants cannot walk, and not all pedestrian deaths involve road crossings. So we can modify the thought experiment and say that each person in South Africa only crosses the road once a year, okay, which is surely a gross underestimate. So 60 million South Africans crossing the road only once a year gives you 60 million road crossings per year, and that's still way larger than the number of fatalities at 5,300. So this back of the envelope calculation suggests that there are on average overwhelmingly more successful than unsuccessful road crossing actions performed in South Africa, even while South Africa is one of the most dangerous countries for pedestrians. Although not 100% reliable, agents' everyday predictive capabilities are reliable enough. Most of us will live to old age having successfully crossed the road thousands of times without tragedy and without having any specific formula where we have to learn a manual or a textbook and this is the rules and here's the, which is what an AI again would have to do. It would have to have a very specific algorithmic formula for how it would interact with complexity, as far as I understand. Okay, so in conclusion, we seem to follow ceteris paribus, but rational rules of thumb, while approximately yet reliably tracking phenomenal regularities in the world to achieve practical goals. In the vast majority of cases, this seems to result in successful actions in complex systems. This suggests a kind of naturalized and instrumental rationality, or what is being called embodied rationality. We are largely rational beings who use reliable heuristics and follow ceteris paribus rules in successfully navigating our complex world. And there's 2 papers I've written recently where I discuss these topics further if you're interested. And those are also in the reference list, which I'll pull up in a moment. But that's the end. Thank you very much.